see him? Good afternoon, everybody. We are very lucky today to have Dr. Steven Hansen from the FDA, who is going to present for us today on remote consenting. Dr. Hansen has been involved with biomedical research in academia and the biotech industry since 2000. He earned a PhD in neurochemistry from Oregon Health and Science University in 2008. This was followed by a research scientist position at the University of Utah Hospital's Department of Clinical Neuroscience. And in 2013, he joined the FDA as a consumer safety officer, predominantly conducting inspections in the bioresearch monitoring operations of the FDA. This area of the FDA is designed to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of subjects, verify the accuracy and reliability of clinical study data, and assess study compliance with FDA regulations. In 2019, Dr. Hansen accepted a position as a first-line supervisor in the Office of BMO's Division 2. He has experience both in conducting and supervising FDA inspections of clinical investigators, sponsors, non-clinical laboratories, and IRBs, as well as post-market adverse drug experience reporting and risk evaluation and mitigation strategies and inspections. So I'd like you all to welcome Dr. Hansen. Before we start though, just a few comments. If you have questions for Dr. Hansen, please put them in the Q&A. And if you have a technical issue, please put that in the chat. So Dr. Hansen, take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. Are you able to hear me? First off, let's get that started.
Yes.
And let me rearrange my screens a little bit, and hopefully you can see me. I'm on video. Everyone can see that. And I'd like to share my presentation as well. So if I'm able to share a screen. Okay. Hopefully everybody could see the screen. Hopefully everybody could see me. Not that you need to see me, but it's always nice to be able to see the speaker. And let me also pull up the, I'll pull up the Q&A little chat box, and we'll kind of monitor this. So yeah, this is an interesting topic. It's one that it may seem big and expansive. It may seem opaque and oppressive. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully I'll help dispel some of the myths and fears about this. I'll go through. I've got a few slides. I've got about I don't know, 25, 30 slides, but I'd like this to be a little interactive. So people put questions or comments in the chat box. I'll probably ask the audience at certain points if they have any experience. And so let's even get started with that. In the Q&A box, has anyone used remote informed consent or electronic informed consents? Let me make sure I have this pulled up correctly. And Teresa Young says yes. Okay, good. So at least one person has. So we're off to a good start there. So let's get into it. Let's start talking about it. Remote informed consent. How is it different? How is it the same? So first off, right off the bat, the informed consent, the process, the forms that people sign, this remains largely the same. When we talk about informed consent, ask yourself, first off, what is it? When does the informed consent process begin? And I'll open it up to the chat again. When does informed consent begin? Not too many people willing to brave that. So really informed consent begins with recruitment. It begins with advertisements, it begins with pamphlets you may have in the lobby of the clinic. Informed consent is not necessarily just the form that people, read and sign. It can be anywhere from 15 to 30 pages. Informed consent is just that. People have enough information to make an intelligent decision if they'd like to participate in a study, in a clinical trial. So informed consent begins right at the time of recruitment, the time of advertisements being set out. Now, we're not going to go too far into the regulations that govern the informed consent, because that's kind of beyond the scope of what we want to talk about here. Regulations, of course, are Part 50, Part 56 of 21 CFR. But now let's talk a little bit about remote informed consent. What is different about that? It's not anything all that unusual, but it's probably not something that you deal with a lot. It's really not too new, but it's not something we engage a lot in the clinical research community. And so with that, here are some things. What are some of the regulations that are going to govern remote informed consent? And again, I'll open it up to the chat box. Any thoughts? What sort of regulations are different when we talk about remote informed consent versus regular informed consent? 21 CFR, Parts 50, Part 56. And I'm looking, we're using the chat box and I don't have anyone answering me. So I don't know if I'm getting all the chats or if people are just kind of quiet because it's a Wednesday afternoon. Informed consent, the regulations are actually the same. The regulations are silent on what form or what media is going to be used when we talk about subjects giving consent to participate in a study. The one thing that might be different is now with remote informed consent, we would start to deal with 21 CFR Part 11. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get going. So just very briefly, I know this group has probably talked about decentralized clinical trials or remote clinical trials, depending on what you want to call it. So I'll just briefly touch on this. Remote informed consent, it's a component of a decentralized clinical trial. DCTs, they can take the form of using telemedicine as opposed to physical in-person visits. When we talk about physical in-person visits, maybe it's not at the actual study site. Maybe it's a mobile or local health provider. So if someone lives 6 cities over, perhaps they could go and have blood drawn at their local urgent care as opposed to driving 45 minutes to get to the clinical site. But also remote or mobile technologies. Mobile technologies can take all sorts of forms. It can be emails, it could be videos, it can be streaming audio. I mean, take your pick. So decentralized clinical trials, they'll use a lot of different terms, remote or direct to participant, electronic, location, hybrid, take your pick. As I just said before, telemedicine, that might be something that's used, local or mobile healthcare providers, mobile technology, tablets, various apps for the phone, for email. Also, if you see up there, I put electronic informed consent. And so here, the use of the word remote informed consent and electronic informed consent can be used interchangeably because they're largely going to be the same thing. Typically under under probably traditional circumstances. We think of informed consent, someone sitting down in a room, they're reading through this 20-page document, the informed consent form, talks all about the study, talks all about what their rights, their obligations are, talks about a little bit about the drug, what they can experience. And at some point, a clinical coordinator might come in and answer any questions. Maybe the clinical investigator or a sub-investigator comes in, answers questions, everybody signs the form, and that's the process. But electronic informed consent, it might be different. Sure, you can have someone physically there reading the informed consent on a tablet, but they don't have to be. They could be at home reading the informed consent on a tablet. And so, what we need to be aware of is, what does this mean now? What form does this take? And I'll also throw this up there: virtual versus decentralized. Virtual, and we won't get too far into this, but if I do accidentally use the term virtual clinical trial or virtual informed consent, that is inadvertent on my part. The agency really uses the term virtual when we talk about clinical trials that are done, really, it says in silico up there, really it's based on modeling or computer modeling, statistical modeling. So it's not involving study subjects. Instead, when we talk about remote clinical trials, we're talking about decentralized clinical trials. And so when we talk about remote informed consent forms, that's what we're talking about. If I accidentally say virtual, it is inadvertent on my part. Now, when we consider remote informed consent form, really a lot of the considerations are the same for in-person informed consent form. First and foremost, we need to ensure the protection, rights, welfare, safety of study subjects. That's the whole point of someone reading through documents. That's the whole point of someone watching videos, is to know what they're getting into. They have rights. They should enter into it with full knowledge and with all information available. They have rights. Their safety should be considered, their welfare. That's the point of all of this. Now, when we talk about electronic informed consent form, and like I said, electronic and remote, those can be used interchangeably. Electronic informed consent form, really, the reason we'd want to do that, amongst others, is to facilitate comprehension of what people are signing on to. And so, you've all seen these 20, 30-page packets of informed consent forms, and people dryly read through the information and they sign off. Maybe they've got a question or two. When we start talking about electronic informed consent forms, now it opens the possibility that we can incorporate other media. We can incorporate videos, for example. We can incorporate hyperlinks to added information. We can even incorporate little Quizlets. Are they sure they understand this part of what is going on? And here's a little quiz to assess their comprehension with it. Also, when we talk about remote or electronic informed consent forms, we want to make sure that the media we're using is what is necessary to the task at hand. And finally, ensure that the quality and integrity of the data is maintained. Electronic informed consent forms, remote informed consent, it can be very powerful, but there are some stipulations involved that it can't just be willy-nilly. It can't just go out in an email and everybody's fine with that. So, as I alluded to before, the regulations are actually the same. Part 50, Part 56, those are regulations concerning informed consent, regulations concerning IRB and the IRB's obligation to study subjects and entering into studies. But also, when we start talking about electronics, we talk about 21 CFR Part 11. And it's kind of big, it's kind of expansive, but it's not scary. So sometimes it's referred to as the predicate rule. Really what Part 11 does is it talks about what are the obligations when we talk about keeping records electronically. This pertains to all records that are required to be maintained by the FDA for regulated industry. So it doesn't matter if it's food manufacturing, drug manufacturing, doesn't matter if it's clinical trials, medical devices, you name it. There are certain records that are under regulation required to be maintained. And so when we talk about 21 CFR Part 11, all this is it talks about these records need to be maintained. Now, if you choose to maintain them in an electronic format, that's fine. Here are the obligations to that. And that's why it's called the predicate rule. It's actually just based upon things that are already required. It's divided up into 3 different subparts. I've pulled this directly out of the online regulations. I put the hyperlink at the bottom there, or at least the URL. So divided up into 3 sections. General provisions, what's the point? The scope, how is it being implemented? And then what are the definitions? When it talks about what a signature is, what does it mean when we say this is a predicate? And when you read any regulation, you'll always find that at the beginning of the regulations, it will go into definitions. What does it mean when we say clinical investigator? What does it mean when we say clinical trial? Next part, subpart B, talks a lot about the closed systems. Really, it stems from the manufacturing, from good manufacturing processes. And so what would be the requirements for keeping electronic records for example, batch records in drug manufacturing? Where I'll talk a little bit more about things that are germane to us, signatures. And so when we talk about remote or electronic informed consent forms, we may be talking about electronic signatures. What are some of the obligations? What are some of the rules? What are some of the suggestions that we need to be cognizant of when we engage in this? So, talk about electronic signatures. The manifestation of the signature itself. What does it mean? It means a bunch of things. It means we have to be assured that the person putting an electronic signature there is the one who is truly signing off on this document. The signature itself, the electronic signature, there needs to be a printed name of the signer. It needs to be readable by human eyes. So it can't just be, in computer code, a series of zeros and ones and zeros. So we need to have the printed name of the electronic signer. There needs to be a date, time of execution. We need to know when this was put on there. And then finally, what is the meaning of this signature? Is this the author of the document signing off saying I authored this and here's my signature saying it's finalized? Is it approving something? Is it just reviewing something? And so I use electronic signatures all day long. There's probably not a day that goes by that I don't sign 10 different things. Everything from signing off on travel authorizations, signing off that I reviewed certain policy documents. And there is a little box for me to check if what is the meaning of this signature. Now, when we talk about some of the general requirements of an electronic signature, and these are very broad. When we start, we'll get back into the electronic informed consent form, the remote informed consent in a little bit. But just when we think of electronic signatures, very broadly speaking, it makes sense, but this is actually written into the regulation itself. So just because it makes sense to you, it doesn't necessarily mean it makes sense to everyone. But the signature itself, it should be unique to the individual, and it should not be able to be reassigned, reused. And that makes sense, right? Everybody's wet signature is or should be unique, and that's what helps identify you, the signer, as signing off on it, as it being authentic. Importantly, when we start talking about electronic records, and this would be germane to anything you keep electronically that you need to attest to the veracity. Signatures should not be able to be cut and pasted. You shouldn't be able to take a screenshot of it and cut and paste it onto another document. There should be stipulations in place. And for example, my electronic signature, you cannot cut and paste that out of documents. And then when we talk about electronic signatures, the granting authority, the person who sets it up, there needs to be some sort of verification process that this electronic signature mechanism that you're granting to this party is indeed truly who they are. It can't be someone who just calls you up on the phone and says, "Hi, my name's Steve. I want to be in your clinical trial. Can you assign me an electronic signature? And I'll log onto your system and start signing things." There needs to be some sort of verification process that it is in fact Steve that's calling up, and not just Steve, but Steven Hansen. Now, when we talk about authenticating electronic signatures or signing it in some way, there's a lot of things that we can consider. There are biometrics. So we could think of biometrics in a lot of different ways, fingerprints, facial recognition, something like that. But perhaps that's beyond the scope of what maybe your remote informed consent can handle. So if biometrics are not being used, there needs to be some sort of way to verify that the person logging on and signing is in fact the person that they say they are. Generally, this can be handled by a code, a user ID, for example, and a password, and probably, you know, everything you do electronically, from logging onto your email to your bank accounts, they're going to have some sort of two-factor authentication. They're going to have a user ID, your code, and a password. You can also imagine there's other things. For example, one of the things I also have is I have a security card that I plug into my computer, and it's got a microchip in it, and then it essentially opens up a gateway for me to type in my username and password. So it's a three-factor authentication. You can envision something very easily similar to that when we talk about remote informed consent. And then finally, the signature should only be used by the genuine owner, and what sort of controls are in place to make sure that that is in fact the case. When we talk about IDs and passwords, they should be unique. And that, again, that makes sense. When you log on to your Gmail account, there shouldn't be 37 people with the Gmail email address, Steven Hansen @gmail, right? The combination, it should be unique to that. So the user ID, the combination, it shouldn't be shared. And that kind of gets back to what we talked about earlier. There should be a process to periodically check the veracity of this to make sure that it is working as it says it is. And if a password user ID needs to be revoked for whatever reason, it's compromised, the person's not in the study anymore, is there a mechanism to have it recalled, revised, or revoked? And then, like I said, periodic testing. It can't just be that the system is set up and then put on autopilot. There needs to be occasional test of it to make sure that it continues to work as it is advertised. Good news is, you don't have to memorize all this. You're not alone. The agency has put out guidance documents specifically on, we put out several documents on Part 11, but specifically on electronic records, electronic signatures. This one was put out several years ago. It's 2003. And so you can see that the agency's mind hasn't really changed on this. When when Part 11 went into effect in the late 90s, this followed by guidance documents, a lot of questions from the industry. So really the agency's mind has been the same for the ensuing almost 20 years. So if you have a chance, go through and read some of these guidance documents. Guidance documents, of course, they inform everyone of what the agency's best thinking on a subject is. It's not regulation, but it tells everyone how the agency plans to interpret the regulation and also how it plans to enforce the regulation as well. So maybe it's not germane to you right now, but as we see, decentralized clinical trials, remote work, remote learning, remote informed consent forms, is something we're using a lot more of. It's kind of been thrust upon us these past 18 months. So it might behoove you to read through some of these guidance documents. And as you can see, I'll usually put up the URL for things. So you can always go back and find this. You don't even need that. You can go to Google and type in FDA guidance Part 11, and you'll probably get 2 or 3 different guidance documents specifically on Part 11. So let's take it back to the topic at hand, remote informed consent. As I said, you can use this interchangeably with electronic informed consent. The traditional method is someone is in a room reading a document, one of the study personnel is sitting with them, or maybe they come in later and answer questions. And you could also envision where this would also be the case if someone were at home, they couldn't make it in, but a clinical coordinator goes out to their house with some sort of a priori arrangement and comes and asks them questions, and they answer questions, and the clinical coordinator is there to witness the signature on the document. They can look at the person's driver's license, they can witness the signature on the document, and that's quintessentially what is done in the clinic anyways. But when we talk about electronic, when we talk about truly remote, there's a lot of things we can do. People can be, for example, emailed a link that would open up a gateway to the informed consent form. Because it's electronic now, again, we can have really cool things. We can have embedded video or audio that explains things, maybe little cartoons that show some of the processes. You can have, as it says there, interactive websites. So again, little Quizlets. They read a section, then they have to answer a question or two on it. Did you truly understand what this was talking about? You also get things like electronic messaging. This is really important. If there's any updates to an informed consent form, it can be handled. I mean, technically, it can be handled electronically. People can get bounced an email saying there's an update to the ICF, go through and read this, take this little quiz, and electronically sign off on it. They won't necessarily need to come into the clinic to get this brand new 30-page informed consent form and then go through it over the course of 30 minutes. Telephone calls, that can also be part of the electronic informed consent. Again, the regulations are actually silent on the media used in electronic informed consent. It can be videos like we're doing now, a Zoom call. It can be telephone calls. It can be, again, interactive websites. And importantly, this is not an all or none approach. If you use one aspect of this, you're absolutely free to use every aspect of this. So just because someone might have a little tablet and they're signing off on an informed consent form, they could still have a Zoom call and have questions answered with the coordinator or the clinical investigator, quote unquote, face to face over a video call. There could be a dozen of other things. I'm sure people can think of things that would be unique to their situations that they may want to employ. And so, kind of as I just alluded to, it can either supplement a paper-based system. So perhaps a paper copy of the informed consent form is mailed to the people at their individual residence, and then followed up with a Zoom call to answer questions, again, quote unquote, face to face. It could be all electronic, it could be partially electronic. It's really not prescribed what one must do. But importantly, this part doesn't change. It needs to be understandable to the subject. And some of the older participants in clinical trials, maybe they're just not comfortable using Zoom. And so even though you might have this perfect remote informed consent process set up and everything looks great and younger people enrolled in it love it, the older people enrolled in it, maybe they're just not familiar with that technology. They don't feel comfortable logging on and providing some sort of biometric marker to authenticate that it's them logging on, signing it. Maybe they don't feel comfortable using their computer camera. And so really, again, we should consider the rights, welfare, and safety of the people participating. Maybe some of the people use the all electronic, maybe some people use paper. It can be kind of a combination of many different things. When we do talk about it though, being electronic, it needs to be user-friendly. And again, think of the average person in your study population. Are they going to know how to use this? Is their ability to go backwards? So if they're reading a PDF page by page, is there an ability to go backwards? Or if they take a quiz and they fail it, what does that mean for them? Are they able to pause it? So if they're 15 minutes into it and they need to step away from their computer, are they able to pause the process and come back to it 30 minutes later, a day later? What does this mean? And if they did pause it, would they have to start completely fresh, or can they start off where they left off? Another important thing, embedded media needs to remain accessible. So for example, and I put up there Adobe Flash Player. As probably many people know, it was actually phased out by Adobe at the end of last year. And so if you have any sort of media on Flash Player, it may not be working. Adobe's not servicing it anymore. And I'll say even internal to the agency, we have this process for onboarding new employees, and some of it is online learning that was in Adobe Flash, and all of a sudden, we don't have that, that training module accessible to people anymore because Adobe Flash is no longer supported. It's not working for us. So if you're using this, and some of the studies that you're engaged in, they may be anywhere from 6 months, you know, if it's a short little vaccine study or for influenza. Sometimes if it's an oncology study, it may run for a couple of years. If it's a cardiac study, I've seen some cardiac studies that run for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And so the media you're using, is it stable enough? Is it a platform that is going to be around? Are you using third-party technology that the third party is going to be around in 6, 7, 8 years? And then the same for hyperlinks. Hyperlinks are great. Again, you can quickly click on something and go right to a web page, go to YouTube, something, and get a lot of information. But as you know, websites are updated constantly. You can probably think of a dozen different things. How many times have you saved a link, you know, on your computer, and you go back to use it again, and it says this link's no longer active, or you get some sort of other information that you're being redirected, or it can't find it, or the page is no longer in service. Take your pick, right? So when we do talk about hyperlinks, and if those hyperlinks are providing meaningful information to the informed consent form, or even if not meaningful, but maybe someone just wants a little bit more information, and that little bit more information is contained in the hyperlinks, how do we know they're being maintained? So these are things that need to be considered when we talk about informed consent, remote informed consent, and if it's right for you in your particular application. Maybe it's great for a shorter study. Like I said, on some of these longer studies, there are things that you need to be cognizant of when thinking about that. And then, as I already talked about, in the general broad section of when we talk about Part 11, electronic signatures, again, the regulations are silent on what form they must take. There could be a lot of things. Computer readable IDs. You could certainly envision a scenario where someone is issued an ID for a study, and they can plug it in to their computer. An ID, it doesn't necessarily need to be an identification card. It could be a little USB dongle, for example. Biometrics, facial scan, thumbprint scan, take your pick. Digital signatures, how's that being maintained? And then also just a simple username password. With the caveat being that when we talk about some of these that are not specifically unique to the individual, so basically anything not biometric, we need to assure that it is, in fact, Steven Hansen who is logging on and signing on behalf of Steven Hansen. And this is exactly as I just said. Is there some sort of way to identify the person logging on? This can be handled a couple different ways. You could do for example, a Zoom meeting, and they present official identification, a driver's license, a passport, and it's got an official government document with their picture and their ID, and the clinical coordinator or the clinical investigator or sub-investigator, take your pick, can affirm that, yes, this is the person I'm talking to. This is Steve Hansen. Here's a government ID, and now I can issue him an electronic signature. I can issue him a password and security question or something like that. Now, the regulations about remote informed consent form. Like I said, they're actually exactly the same as others. You just need to consider Part 11. But when we talk about remote informed consent form, electronic informed consent form, subjects still need to be given a copy of it. And how is that maintained? Is it just simply a hyperlink? Do you email them a PDF of it? Like I said, they still need to be given a copy. They still need to have access to the information. They still need to know who they can contact in case of emergency. They need to know who the IRB is. If they have complaints, they want to complain to the IRB. So you can imagine if they log on to a website and they use their password and their user ID, and they read through it and they sign it, and then, okay, it's now legally executed, and then it goes away. How do they go back and get this information? Do they have to log back onto this website? What if their privileges were revoked for whatever reason? How do they get in touch with the clinical investigator? How do they get in touch with the IRB? So in some way, there still needs to be a copy that is given to the study subject. IRB oversight, that remains the same. The IRB still needs to sign off on things. So when we talk about embedded video or embedded audio, when we talk about hyperlinks to websites, the IRB still needs to approve all of this. That part doesn't go away. Remember, the informed consent process, it's absolutely everything. It's not just this document that someone reads through and signs. It's everything about it. It is the advertisement. It is hyperlinks to more information about the study. And the IRB needs to be involved in all of that as well. And then finally, and this kind of I alluded to earlier, the archival and retrieval of the electronic informed consents. Where are they stored? Is it in the cloud? Who's maintaining access to the cloud? Is it the sponsor? Is it the individual clinical investigator? You know, what does this mean? If the FDA shows up at your doorstep and we're doing an inspection, how do we get access to all of these? How can these be retrieved easily? And that's you know, part of the regulation. They need to be retrievable. They need to be in a format that is readable. Again, it can't be in just zeros and ones. And you know, you need this special software that only the sponsor has in order to decode it and read it. Once again, you're not alone. The agency has put out guidance documents for electronic informed consent. And again, I'll say it again, this can be used interchangeably when we talk about remote informed consent. This guidance document, it's new-ish, so it's about 5 years old. But it shows that the agency is very comfortable with the use of different platforms. And so that kind of presages the next question. Does the FDA support electronic and remote informed consent? And probably a lot of people, there's a lot of trepidation and a lot of hesitancy to do some of these things, right? We've always done it this way. We've always had people come in and sign a paper copy. It's always worked for us. And now when we start talking about electronic this, electronic that, now we need to think about Part 11, that can cause a lot of anxiety. Why fix it if it's not broken in the first place? Well, like I said, the agency does support the use of electronics for conducting clinical trials. We support the use of electronic informed consent forms. To that end, putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak, the FDA has been in development of what's called an FDA My Studies app, an app for exactly that, clinical trials, apps that can be downloaded by clinical sites and study subjects, apps that are to be used for really real world data in clinical trials. This is actually being done by the agency in conjunction with partners at Harvard and this Harvard Sentinel group. This was a publication that was put out a few years ago, 2018, and it really talks about the My Studies app that the agency is working on. So the agency, FDA, has been working on this for a few years. What form will it take? How will it be encompassed? What should be included? What should not? What are the security and safeties on this? Like I said, Part 11. I mean, we certainly wouldn't ignore Part 11 ourselves on our own app as we're rolling this out and making this available to the general public. So it's kind of taken a while, and it's moving at the speed of government, all until about 18 months ago. So here's some information on it. Decentralized clinical trials, study subjects that might be in isolation, maybe they'd want to use the My Studies app, is really for gathering real world evidence. Linking, for example, electronic medical records to clinical trial records where that may be appropriate. And as I just said, it was moving at its own pace. But 18 months ago, something new hit the market, COVID, right? It changed the landscape for all of us, for you conducting clinical trials, for us, the regulatory oversight agency that oversees clinical trials. In the intervening months, FDA has put out several guidance documents on what changes with COVID. Everything from, sterile manufacturing of saline to how to conduct clinical trials during a time of COVID. This was one that was put out last March. It was most recently updated just a few months ago, back in January. Really, it talks about conducting clinical trials during a public health emergency, guidance for industry, guidance for investigators, IRBs, sponsors, you name it. So it talks heavily about what's changed. And perhaps it's more beyond the scope of what we wanted to talk about today, but really, how is the agency viewing clinical trials, and including the use of remote platforms, remote informed consent forms, telemedicine visits. So go through and read this if you haven't already. Go through and read this. It is still being actively updated. Like I said, last update to it was in January. But then, very recently, and I think it was June of last year, the agency rolled out the My Studies app. They rolled it out for widespread use. They actually named it the COVID-19 My Studies app. You can find it on the Apple Store. You can find it on Google Play Store. I went in just this morning and confirmed it's still there on both Android and Apple. So you can go here, download this app, and it's a very interesting thing. It's available to study subjects. It's available to clinical sites. What it is clinical investigators, clinical sites, sponsors, they can submit their informed consent form to the agency. And you can go to the website here, the URL, it talks all about how to do this. You submit your ICF to the agency, it gets vetted, it gets uploaded into this app, and then when your study subjects download this app, they can find the study, go through it. So it's kind of taken a lot of the labor and guesswork out of setting up your own app, setting up your own remote informed consent form. So this is something that is now available. It's something that I don't know how widespread use it is right now. I don't know what the market looks like for it right now, but I do know that I do know of at least one group that has used it, and they seem to be pleasantly surprised with it. So with that, that's what I wanted to talk about today. It's not that scary. Remote informed consent form. It's the same thing you've always been doing with added benefits of things like people don't need to drive all the way into the clinic if they are, an hour, 3 hours away. Added benefits of providing more information to people, videos, audio, added benefits of rolling out updates to the informed consent form very, very quickly. You don't need to wait 3 months for their next visit for them to come in and sign the new ICF. With that, however, there are obligations. Talked a little bit about when we think of electronic records, electronic signatures, but then talked a little bit about the My Studies app that FDA has rolled out. There are other things. I know some sponsors are rolling out their own types of things. So hopefully this dispelled some of the trepidation, some of the fears. With that, I'll open it up to questions. I do have a very hard deadline at the top of the hour. I need to get off for another meeting. But with that, why don't we go ahead and start answering questions, and whatever, you can take yourself off mute and ask me, or you can put it in the chat box. I'll get us started. It looks like we've got a couple of questions in the chat box. What are lessons learned from BIMO audits on sites using electronic consents? Any common threads? Good question. Lessons learned. We don't see a lot of it right now. It is actually still very rare to see that. There's nothing wrong with it. Like I said, provided that the information is accessible. If one of my investigators shows up to your site and wants to look at informed consent forms, they need to be provided in some sort of usable media. So if they're all in PDF format, that can be provided that way. FDA investigators may choose to look at some of the audit trails. How authentic is this signature? What did you do to verify the identity of the study subject? But lessons learned, I don't know there's a lot, because it's just not used a lot. I think in the next couple of years, as more applications are put into the agency by sponsors, and a lot of these studies were ongoing during a time of COVID. I'm sure we'll start to see more of it, but right now I don't have a lot to add to that. Next question. Remote informed consent seems limiting of discussions. How could this be compensated for? Limiting of discussions, and I think maybe what the question is alluding to is if someone has emailed the informed consent form and they read it and sign it, but they don't have any back and forth discussion or opportunity. And if I didn't answer that question, or if I misinterpreted it, then put it back in the chat box or come off mute. But like I said, I mean, it could be done a couple of different ways. You could literally have a Zoom meeting and share a screen, as I'm doing now, and both the study subject, the coordinator, the clinical investigator, sub-investigator, they can go through it together and have a discussion that way. That's one possibility. It could be just a back and forth of a chat, putting things into a chat box or email. So there's that. By the way, participant and coordinator. I think I got that. Then follow up is Zoom HIPAA compliant. I don't know. I think it is. I do know a lot of hospitals, especially during COVID, have started using Zoom and having this, physician to physician discussion about a patient they're doing via Zoom. I won't make assumptions. I know initially when COVID hit and the government-wide, we went into a lot of work at home where work at home was possible. We were not using Zoom. We have recently in the past, I don't know, 4 months, there's been a new Zoom for government. That's actually the name of it. So it's a Zoom platform that is tailored to government and for security reasons. That's what we started using now. So maybe that answers it, maybe it doesn't. You'd probably have to check with Zoom to make sure that they are compliant with all the HIPAA regulations.
So do we have any additional questions? I know I have one for Dr. Hansen. This is Priscilla. If we need to verify that the informed consent was done properly, should we keep the recordings of the Zoom meetings that we have between the investigators, the coordinators, and the participants?
That's a great question, and watch me duck, dodge, and parry on the answer. There's again, the regulations are kind of silent on specifics of media. You do need to be able to verify certain things. So the regulations don't necessarily say you must keep a recording, but if there were ever a question about anything, how could you go back and verify that? And you might say, well, how do you verify that in a room with a study subject and a coordinator, and they're both sitting there physically? A great point. Generally, their signatures or authenticated wet signatures would testify to that. So if I ever had to go back and talk to coordinator Bob, I could go and say, is this your signature, Bob? And he says yes, and ask him to describe this. Then I could go and talk to study subject Jim and say, Jim, is this your signature? And can you verify this? So I mean, there are possibilities in physical, or traditional physical posture. So would it behoove you to keep an electronic recording? You would never be wrong for documenting and keeping documentation of your actions. They don't take up much space on a hard drive or some sort of removable media. You would never be wrong to essentially kind of CYA. So it's neither a yes nor a no, but think of your own situation and think if there were ever questions that come up 6 months from now, 2 years from now, could you go back and demonstrate what happened? And it may not seem like that big of a deal when it's coordinator Bob and study subject Jim. What about if it's a vulnerable population? What about if it's a subject that can't consent for themselves? And so the legally authorized representative is doing it for them. Do you have your bases covered to make sure everything was done? What about if it was a child? Did they assent? How can you verify that? How can you make sure that really you're on the side of angels? So I hope that answered your question, Priscilla. I know I didn't give you a definitive yes, no, but food for thought. Think about this as you kind of tailor electronic and remote work to your study, to your organization.
No, that was great. Thank you. Are there any other questions for Dr. Hansen? I really enjoyed the talk, and I thought it was very, very helpful to know the FDA side of things as we move forward in this unknown environment. I also would like to remind all of the participants to do the evaluation. It's in the chat box. So please fill that out, because I'm sure we can all benefit by that. But thank you again, Dr. Hansen. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. I hope you got some things out of it. Maybe some of it was very reiterative. Maybe some of it was new. But thank you for inviting me. I always enjoy coming in and talking to different groups.
Thank you again. And I think that concludes our workshop. Our next one will be on August 11th, and it's Dr. Heidi Maloney from the VA, who is the IRB chair at the VA, but she's going to be talking about telehealth and IRB regulations.
Priscilla, can you mention about the evaluation?
Oh, I thought I did. It's in the link to the evaluation is in the chat box. So please, everybody, please fill out the evaluation. It's very helpful to us to see your thoughts on these workshops. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.